Good morning, friends. My name is Rob Hardees. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm very delighted to be with you here for worship this morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Morgan, for that lovely introduction. I'm pleased to share worship with you and to support this period of rest and renewal for Reverend Rebecca Savage, who is a dear friend and a beloved colleague. Happy to help out the team here supporting that sabbatical. Yeah, so good to be with you all. For our reading this morning, I'd like to share a poem by the Nobel laureate poet Louise Glück. Louise was a teacher and mentor to my husband, Chris, who is also a poet. And early in our relationship, Chris would court me by reading Louise's poems to me. So I'm a little partial to them, you know. These poets have their wiles. So he would often read me this one called Snowdrops, which is written in the voice of a wildflower, a snowdrop, emerging from the earth after a long winter. And for me, the poem captures a dimension of what it's been like to emerge slowly from this long season of pandemic. So, Snowdrops. Do you know what I was? How I lived? You know what despair is, so winter should have meaning for you. I did not expect to survive earth suppressing me. I didn't expect to waken again, to feel in damp earth my body able to respond again, remembering after so long how to open again in the cold light of earliest spring. Afraid? Yes. But among you again, crying, yes, risk joy in the raw wind of the new world. So my message this morning is called Dare to Love Again. And I'd like to introduce that theme by sharing with you a brief story from the life of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the Unitarian minister, philosopher, and essayist. There's probably no one who's had a greater influence on our Unitarian Universalist tradition than Emerson. He is our great philosopher of hope and possibility. In fact, he once called himself a professor of the joyous science. Emerson's joyous science, his hope, was deeply shaped by his Unitarian faith, a faith that swapped out Calvinism and its tragic sense of human sinfulness and fallenness for a theology that emphasized a divine potential and agency within every human being. What Adrian alluded to in his prayer as something extra inside of us, right? But in 1842, Emerson's joyous science would be sorely tested. Because in January of that year, his darling 5-year-old son, Waldo Jr., died of scarlet fever. And Emerson was bereft. On the very night of his son's death, he scrawled a letter to his dear friend Margaret Fuller, wondering, quote, "Shall I ever dare to love anything again?" What a heartbreaking and poignant question. Shall I ever dare to love anything again? It turns out it wasn't the first time Emerson had asked himself that question. A decade before his son's death, Emerson's beloved first wife, Ellen, died of tuberculosis at a very young age. After her death, Emerson walked to her grave every day for a year. Even so, he couldn't quite come to terms with her loss, couldn't accept that his wife was gone. So one day he went to the grave and had her grave exhumed so that he could see her one last time. Shocking. But he needed to see for himself again. Only then could he begin to entertain the question, do I dare to love again? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Do I dare to love again? I know I have. I believe many of us have. We need only listen to the joys and sorrows shared this and every week here in church to be reminded of the many ways that the circumstances of our lives are always challenging us to summon the courage to love again. When a loved one dies, do I dare to love again? When a marriage or other relationship ends suddenly or painfully, do I dare to love again? When someone we trust has betrayed or disappointed us, when an institution we believed in let us down. Heck, when we live through a week like this one with multiple mass shootings and still more horrific evidence of police brutality against people of color. Do I dare to believe again? To trust again? To hope again? Do I dare to love again? Our opening hymn this morning, Just as Long as I Have Breath, considers this very question. Now, I don't know about you, but that hymn is one of my favorite hymns in our hymnal. I love to sing it, but I can never get through it without crying. And it's always the last verse that gets me. Just as long as I have breath, I must answer yes to love. Disappointment pierced me through, still I kept on loving you. Disappointment pierced me through, still I kept on loving you. Whew, that's the line right there. My tears flow, and they're tears of grief for the times when love's bitter disappointments have pierced my heart. For me, singing that song is always a kind of catharsis of sorts, a kind of ritual opportunity to mourn and release love's disappointments. In the same way, perhaps, that Emerson's daily walks to his wife's grave were for him a form of mourning and of letting go. Allowing ourselves to truly grieve love's disappointments. This is a critical step in being able to dare to love again. We must tend to our broken hearts. But over the years, I've discovered that there's something more going on with my tears when I sing that line in that hymn. Yes, they're tears of loss and mourning, but I now see that there is a gratitude that is mingled with that loss. Disappointment pierced me through, still I kept on loving you. That still speaks to love's endurance and resilience, even in the face of loss. And I find myself shedding tears of gratitude for my own capacity to love again in spite of disappointment. And even more, my gratitude for the grace that has been extended to me when others have continued to love me. God bless them. Even after I've disappointed them or hurt them. Disappointment pierced me through, still I kept on loving you. Imagine how lonely we'd all be if our love never survived disappointment. It's a precious kind of love, this love that survives disappointment. It's hard-won, resilient, something to be cherished. But I'll tell you, over the course of my ministry, I've met those whose capacity for love didn't survive loss or disappointment. I've listened as people approaching death have reflected back on their lives. And for those whose capacity for love has been badly damaged by loss, their regret was palpable. Right? It's not as though there was one dramatic moment when they swore off love forevermore. Instead, what they described to me is a gradual accumulation over time of loss and disappointment, followed by layer after layer of self-defense and self-protection. Now, to be sure, that impulse to protect our hearts is, after we're hurt, is understandable and often a healthy reaction. But when allowed to accumulate over time, our defenses can leave our hearts so well fortified they can no longer be reached. I once saw a New Yorker cartoon that poked gentle fun at our often self-defeating attempts at self-protection. In the cartoon, a king, dressed in his robe and crown, reclines on a psychoanalyst's couch. A thought bubble shows the king imagining himself garrisoned in a well-fortified castle surrounded by a moat. And in the caption below, the psychiatrist says to the king, "Enemies, yes, but doesn't your moat also keep out love?" Poor king. Poor us. I think it's probably a good idea for us to periodically check in with ourselves and notice where our hearts feel defended, and ask ourselves, even if those defenses once served us well, do they serve us still? In the end, I think Emerson's good friend, Henry David Thoreau, might have said it best. Thoreau once fell deeply in love with and courted a young woman named Ellen Sewell. But Sewell chose as her husband one of Thoreau's best friends instead. After this heartbreak, Thoreau also considered the question, do I dare to love again? And finally came to this conclusion in his journal. He wrote, "The only remedy for love is to love more." What other choice do we have? Dare to love again. You know, implicit in this word, dare, is another word, courage. The courage that it takes to love again after loss. Because it's risky business, this love thing, right? What if I get hurt again? What if someone lets me down again? In the face of such fears, what does courage look like? Courage doesn't ask us to banish our fears or deny them or suppress them. To have courage, we must simply cherish in our hearts something that is greater than our fear, something more powerful, more compelling, like the promise of the joy we might experience if only we allowed ourselves to love again. And this is what I love about that poem that I shared at the beginning. I admire the courage of that wildflower who's endured a long winter trapped beneath the earth. Let's again just listen to a bit of her testimony. Do you know what I was, how I lived? I didn't expect to survive, earth suppressing me. I didn't expect to waken again, to feel in damp earth my body able to respond again. Remembering after so long how to open again in the cold light of earliest spring. Afraid? Yes. But among you again, crying, yes, risk joy in the raw wind of the new world. Friends, after nearly 3 years of pandemic, we too are returning slowly, fitfully, to a new world, a new normal. A world that is in many ways transformed not only by pandemic, but by intransigent racial injustice, by threats against our democracy, by the existential threat of climate change. Meanwhile, the pandemic has left us lonelier and more isolated than ever before. As we return to this new world, the critical question before us is, do we dare to love again? Do we dare to push back against our pandemic isolation? Do we dare to believe in the future of religious communities such as this one? Do we dare to trust that the values that we cherish and believe in will indeed prevail in our world? I'll close by saying that way back at the end of the 19th century, the philosopher William James spoke words that are more true today than when he first uttered them. He said, "Friends, we live in a world that is uncertain of being saved." And then he posed this question to his listeners. He asked them, are you willing to participate in such a world? Are you willing to risk loving a world whose salvation is uncertain? Do you dare? Now more than ever, we must dare to love our world. Now more than ever, we must dare to love and trust one another. Now more than ever, we must dare to love again. May it be so, and amen.